Hello, my name is Daniel Pressman, and I'm arguing that the United States federal government ought to pay reparations to African Americans. So, what my plan would offer to do is offer free pre-K for all African Americans, equitable school funding for schools from poor areas, and I'll explain more of what that means later, and then free tuition at public universities for African Americans. So, not paying reparations, which is what our society is doing right now, is wrong on a number of levels. First off, African Americans' chances at short and long term success have been hurt through centuries of slavery, 60 years of Jim Crow laws and segregation, along with decades of racist housing policies, zoning, and community development, which continue in a large part today. In terms of slavery, just think according to a study in JSTOR, slaves made it possible for many whites to go into more rewarding occupations, to gain increased skills, and to generate greater lifetime earning for themselves and their descendants. In these indirect and passive ways, slavery produced enormous benefits beyond those usually considered, and this segues perfectly into my next point, which is that we are still lacking true diversity, not to mention equality, as a country. According to a study done by Michael A. Fletcher of the Washington Post, the black unemployment rate has consistently been twice as high as the white unemployment rate for the past 50 years. The gap in household income between blacks and whites hasn't narrowed in the last 50 years. The black poverty rate is no longer declining. Black children are far more likely than whites to live in areas of concentrated poverty, and there are way more blacks in prison than whites. Not to mention there are less African Americans in classrooms, graduating college, in the workforce, not to mention well-acclaimed jobs in the workforce. And at this point in society, diversity and inequality should be staples of our country. So we need to move on uh, in towards these ideals. It's obvious these harms are bad, but all that talk doesn't mean much if my plan doesn't solve for these harms. And as the great Nelson Mandela once said, education is the most powerful weapon which we can choose to change the world. And right now, our world's in need of changing, and we shouldn't look further than education. As for why pre K would make a difference in African Americans' lives, a study done by the APA on Oklahoma's universal pre K system basically proves that this universal pre K program has succeeded in enhancing the school readiness of a diverse group of children. So, free pre K for all African Americans would allow millions of children to not enter our public education system already behind their counterparts, a gap that isn't overcome in many cases. Now, once there, with an equitable funding system, it would allow for a fairer school system that ensures a more level playing field. Now, in case you don't know what equitable funding is, basically what this means is taking property taxes and distributing the taxes according to which schools are in higher need of funding, not the way it currently is, which is if you pay higher property taxes, your school gets more funding. So schools from rich areas would be getting less funding than schools from poorer areas, despite paying higher property taxes. With equitable funding, a lot of the ideas that the rich are funding a lot of the poor's education, and with our upper and upper middle classes still being predominantly white, and our working and poverty classes still having large percentages of African Americans, this would be in a way for whites to make up for past wrongs through paying for better educations for African Americans, which in turn would hopefully lead to not just higher high school graduation rates, but increased college readiness and acceptance and enrollment to colleges for African Americans. Then moving on to free public university education, this also ensures that African Americans can continue their education, that money won't be an issue, or lack of legacies at the schools won't deprive these students from getting a good education. And the goal is through all this increased education for African Americans, there would be more people of color in higher education classrooms, which would translate into better jobs, lower rates of poverty, unemployment, and people in prison, better communities for African Americans to live in, and ultimately just a more diverse nation while slowly killing off racism in this country. With all this in mind, I believe it is in our nation's best interest and the world's best interest for these reparations to be given to all African Americans. Thank you.